Yentob, described by many as a BBC lifer, has been in a prominent position at the organisation since 1985, when he was moved to the top job in BBC Arts. And from Arena to AbFab to Imagine and to running the BBC in various guises, it's no surprise that he's never far from praise, nor criticism, perhaps. And I always say that art allows us to ask the questions why in the most amazingly creative ways. And so what we're going to do today is use Alan's distinguished career and his work to explore some pretty big themes in the arts. Mr. Alan Yentob, the man who said yes to me and meant it. Welcome to the show. Before we get going, I have to ask you a pressing question. Why is the media obsessed these days with either youth or celebrity or reality or kind of shock shows? I've seen it. You've seen it.
Well, God knows. I have no idea. Everything is changing. The media, the transformation of the media, the digital realm, AI, all that has changed everything. Social media has now taken over. So there are no surprises there. And the gap between the different generations is also really creating a sort of split, really, as well. So who knows? We're living in extraordinary times. That's the truth.
They are extraordinary times, and it's interesting that immediately there you talk about the intergenerational thing that's going on, and it's one of the things that I say that I love to do with this program, because I'm all about letting the oldies, that's us grown-ups, still have a voice. But obviously that voice is not just for us to pat each other on the back. It's with the idea of it's being informed view to help to guide the next generation. And some of the most exciting conversations actually are those between the intergenerations. But I mean, I don't need to tell you that. You've got a lifetime of telling stories and making stories. But something, Alan, something else I want to talk to you about is finding stories, because that's something that surprised me, because in my day, that was the whole thing. That's kind of what you measured the weight of a journalist by. It was their contacts, it was their nous, it was their ideas, it was the ways that they could turn the most obscure of ideas, if you like, into something that was relevant and bears resonance with all of us. And you did that. That's kind of, I think, in a nutshell, what Imagine was doing. It was bringing the arts to the masses. Was that kind of the intention, Alan?
Well, the whole thing started with Arena, really essentially the arts thing, which is nearly now, it's over 50 years Arena has been going. And I'll just tell you, I mean, originally when I joined the BBC when I was 20 years old, a long, long time ago, that's over half a century, that's the honest truth. And when I applied to the BBC, I was at uni, and there was an application form for for these traineeships, and there were only 5 on offer, and there were tens of thousands of applications. So at the top of the form it said, we have tens of thousands of applications, we only have 5 places, so let us know why you think it should be you.
Yeah.
And about 30 years ago I gave the first BAFTA lecture when I was running BBC 2 at the time, or BBC 1 even, I can't remember, it was long, long ago. And I answered that question, and I asked the BBC, who of course retain everything, or just about everything, if I could see my application form. And they sent it me, and I saw this very scruffy response to why it should be me. And my reply was really badly written. It was partly handwritten and partly printed, partly typed, because I wasn't much good at typing in that time. And I said, well, at the age of 8, I played one of the wives in The Merry Wives of Windsor. Okay. And one of my contemporaries said, you have lovely legs, you should be in show business. And so lo and behold, I then got the job. So I think writing, what you write in your application forms is very important. And every time I've got a doctorate or been to a university or handed out degrees. I've always told them that and said, you can still have hope, because that was my application form, and I'm now director of television at the BBC, so have a go. So that's how it all started. I went to the BBC. I started in radio. I started in Bush House, which was extraordinary. And Bush House went on for 24/7. No one ever went to bed. You were reporting around the world. And my first gig, I interviewed Idi Amin, the dictator,
Yes.
and Harold Pinter on the same day. That was my start, and I never went backwards. So that was it.
I can imagine. I bet you can remember as well. I bet you can remember the interview with Idi Amin, can't you?
I can sort of remember it. The BBC probably has it. I must retain it, but I haven't listened to it for many years because I have done so many interviews. I mean, there are about 700 arenas on the BBC. The BBC has. There are 250 hours of Imagine, and then there are all the shows I've commissioned. And I've just, as you've seen, been revisiting my past with. There's a show coming out about French and Saunders coming out on the 27th. I've just done something with Russell T Davis, which went out on Monday, which has had reviewed in every paper. And I did something about Manchester, revisiting Manchester, as you know, because you were there. And so, I've been very lucky, and I've got to know so many people and made friendships with all kinds of people: Mel Brooks, Orson Welles, David Bowie. I mean, the Philip Roth, Stanley Kubrick. These all became close friends of mine. So I've been lucky.
The names go on, and you say that you've been lucky, and it's interesting that you start there. I want to talk to you about the Imagine films. I'm going to ask you questions on both of them separately. The film with Russell T Davis. I'm going to tell you now, I'm just going to say thank you. Okay, thank you. That is as me, a 63-year-old. I'm 64 now. Sorry, I've forgotten I've had a birthday.
Yeah.
Watching that program, I learned things, Alan. I think this is it anyway. I mean, people's minds need to be open. But I watched that program on Monday night and I was almost breathless in parts. I was learning as I was going along. I was learning, I was discovering. It was done with such tenderness and such love. So it's interesting. I'm going to talk to you about it. I'm going to talk to you about that at the end. But, you know, you've mentioned Russell and you've mentioned your friends and you've mentioned the relationship that you have with people. And I think that when you're involved in the industry for such a long time, you develop relationships. And that's, to me, what it's always been about. It's always been on the strength of my relationships and how I treat people and, the respect and courtesy and this, that, and the other. And yet they've looked to you and they've called, almost dismissively, Al's pals. Well, I would say we should be saying, I'm delighted that they are Al's pals, because if that's what allows us to see a part of their world, then that's good enough for me. It's not something to be criticised. Why is there this kind of, it seems like it's like an almost like a nitpicking kind of thing going on?
I think there is a reason for it, because I think I have a sort of odd, slightly unique position in the BBC, because I was running the BBC and I was even creative director, and when I was running Imagine for at least 12 years or 15 years. In fact, 15 years at least, where I had a double life. And because I was on TV and I was being seen and I was being seen to run the place as well, it all felt self-indulgent, or indulgent. And it was also an opportunity for some of the press, I won't mention which newspapers, and they still carry on doing it, to sort of find a way to sort of target people who the public might recognize. And I was one of those targets. But because I love the BBC and believe in it, and despite many offers to do other jobs, I've stayed loyal to the BBC all these years, because I believe in its value. And I believe that value that needs to be spoken of, and people need to support the BBC because it's an extraordinary organization, particularly in this era when the world is so much more divided. And if you look at the BBC as an anchor for the creative industries in the UK and around the world. I mean, BBC World, the World Service, the role of the BBC in being inclusive and drawing everyone in, for instance, in Manchester, for instance, in Salford, that's such an important centre for the BBC. Look at Doctor Who now coming out of Wales. Wales is now a kind of centre for really important. It's got a huge. The Bad Wolf Studios is compares and with the big American studios, and Disney has become a partner with Bad Wolf, and Jane Tranter, who runs Bad Wolf, was head of drama at the BBC, worked for me, was working in the BBC for years. So, and you'll find also, but if you look in America and around the world, or you look at ITV, or you look at Channel 4, all those people were once in the BBC. So the BBC is a very important part of the BBC culture and tradition. We must also remember that culture and the media is, culture is about who we are. It's about our everyday lives. It's about everything. It's not just about art. It's about something much broader and more important. And I think the BBC connects to that. So yes, I think going forward, it's very important. The BBC has had its budgets cut. It's not getting inflation. It's under threat quite a lot of the time, at a time when the big streaming giants have got very, very deep pockets. And it's underestimated how important the BBC is to people in the UK. The fact is that if you look at the figures, the audience figures for the BBC, they're still absolutely huge. And the price of paying for it is relatively modest. It's a household price, and the BBC has to compete with so many, and it's a trusted organization. It's always unchallenged. We're going through difficult times now with the war in Israel, which is deeply distressing for everyone. And the BBC is challenged by this, because remember, it's a global organization. It's a trusted one, so it has to be able to signify to people across the world that it's impartial, which doesn't mean it doesn't tell the truth, but it doesn't take sides. It tells the story as it knows it. Now, it's an incredibly important value to people, and it's got to be supported.
It's interesting. You mentioned so many things in that one answer, Alan. And number one is your love of the BBC. And I think that's apparent. I think it's apparent, regardless of the criticism or whatever. I think it's apparent. The other thing that you talked about was your deep love for what it did and what it represents, and the fact that it's trusted. And you and I know that they use this word, the public service broadcasting. Do you think that they're still intent on public service broadcasting? Do you not think that they've been seduced also by the nonsense that's going on out there?
I don't know about seduced, but the world is changing, and the transformation of the world in the last, with digital media, with AI, with all of this going on at the moment, means that, public service broadcasts are struggling. The advertising industry is not what it was. So Channel 4 and ITV are challenged by this. The idea that the BBC should be, there shouldn't be a license fee, will only mean that the BBC then competes with not just the streamers, but more importantly with ITV and Channel 4. And that competition will be really damaging to ITV and Channel 4. So the BBC and public service broadcasting needs to be sustained and supported, particularly because it is inclusive, because it draws people together. And, I'm hoping that in the next year or two, that this message will get out, and that those people who support the BBC will get out there and realize what they'll be missing if they don't get the BBC that they've loved for all these years. Also, there's another great asset the BBC has, and which is an extraordinary range of content. And it's what we call archive. Isn't really archive. Disney doesn't talk about its archive. It talks about its extraordinary range of content. And that's what the BBC has. And there are many ways to share this, not just in the UK, but with the world. And that's something that I'm very, very supportive of, and want to find ways in which that incredible sort of archive can be seen to be content which can be shared with both generations. I mean, I have this idea that BBC Forward should be handed over to the young, that the YouTubers and the young people should realize that their legacy of this that is available on the archive is not something that's irrelevant to them and to their lives. You know, when my kids were listening to Frank Sinatra and Bob Marley in the early days of their lives, and I think there's so much there that the young can discover and share with their contemporaries. And we need to find ways to do that. So people don't imagine the past is irrelevant. There are lessons from the past to be learned. There are extraordinary things to be found and discovered. And it will be a revelation to many who don't know about these things, who are stuck on social media in one particular place. We need to open people's minds. I've always thought that curiosity, I have a company which I call I Am Curious Productions. That's its title. And curiosity and creativity are very connected. And if you want to find out about the world, you need to be asking questions. You need to be finding answers. You need to search for things, not to go always to the same place to confirm your prejudices. So there's a lot we have to learn. There's a lot of progress that needs to be made. We've been through most extraordinary 5 years. You know, if you think about the lessons we've learned about the environment, about the AI, about cities and how cities grow, and if there are any high streets anymore, do you go shopping or do you just go to Amazon and whatever? How do we connect with each other? How do we share things in a way that allows us to open our minds? In fact, I think, you know, you're sitting in Manchester where this tremendous show of Danny Boyle's Free Your Mind is going to be on the BBC, that show. I've managed to get that to happen in the, I think it's New Year's Eve on BBC Two. That fantastic show of Danny's, which draws in different generations, different ethnicities. Danny is a curious man, and he wants to share things. And Free Your Mind is essential in this new era that we're entering in. Don't be stuck in a corner. Open up, look and listen. That's the most important lesson we can learn.
Well, I think that's the thing, isn't it? It gives you a vehicle, if you like, to explore. I believe anyway, to explore lots of things that perhaps, you know, we don't have the immediate answers.
Very good point. I mean, I would say also about the current situation we're in. There's a great program maker called Norma Percy, who's got some shows about Vladimir Putin coming out, who has done shows about Russia, about the Middle East, and her survey of the Middle East over, you know, decades is absolutely extraordinary, and they're all on the iPlayer to be seen. And if you want to know the real story about the Middle East, then you need to watch and learn from Norma Percy's programs. They're all there on the BBC iPlayer, and they're a fascinating insight, and they don't take sides. And she has access to all kinds of people from every side who have spoken to her, and she really understands this need to give people the stories and let them make their own minds up about what they believe, but give them the facts and let them hear them.
Yes, yes. It's extraordinary. You know, you talked about the awful situation that we have in the world. There's no words, Alan, and I think it's much too sensitive to try and glib over. So we will leave it. Just understanding where I come from is, you know, I'm a pretty old bird here, Alan. I'm about understanding the difference between right and wrong, and fundamentally understanding the difference between right and wrong. That's how we were brought up. We had morals, we had values, and it's that I see.
Well, all sides do right and wrong. You know, you know, whether it's Israel or Hamas or whatever, there's right and wrong on all sides. What we
Yes.
need now is to come together and find a way forward. And that means a conversation. And that's the issue across the world now. You know, there need to be conversations. We need not to have victims of all of this all over the place who are, I mean, we talk about what's happening in Israel, but you know, if you look at what happened in Cambodia and what the Americans and British did in Iraq and what's going on in Yemen and elsewhere, you know, these stories disappear.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we need to understand we need to move on in the world, but it's the idea that innocent people are killed in this way, that war seems to be a solution to everything, is just so shocking. We haven't learnt.
You know, you talked about our new world and AI. A long time ago, you were actually responsible for young people and for data capture at the BBC. Did you guys see this coming? Did you see it coming?
Well, up to a point we did, and I think you can see from, again, coming back to Free Your Mind and the film of The Matrix, that was many years ago, and that was seen. Alan Turing was sitting in Manchester and discovering and realizing something was coming. And I have made a lot of shows about this story. I've followed it on Imagine as well, about the fact that books were disappearing, and that the beginning of this digital realm, the beginning of this story, we all thought. I did a show called Here Comes Everybody. It seemed like a positive thing. It seemed like it was going to change things. And still, AI, there is the good, the bad, and the ugly. We need to find ways to use it effectively, and not abuse it. And that needs, again, to come back to this thing. It needs a conversation. It needs fairness. It needs a way of. There are lots of ways in which this new technology can help to transform people's lives in a positive way. Can help the health system. Can help the education system. It can do things, but it can also, you know, be abused. So really, you know, there are many challenges ahead for the next generation, many challenges ahead.
No, absolutely. You talked about AI for good, and interestingly enough, that was something that I looked at a few weeks ago on this very show. But the thing that I think is causing the concern with AI is its ability to learn from you, to learn from itself, and to create. And it's that ability to create. And I think it's that is causing I'm not going to say the cause for concern, but it's making you think, hang on a minute, what are these possibilities? Which actually very nicely lets me flip flop into the matrix and free your mind, because it is about endless possibilities, isn't it, Alan? It's endless possibilities, I think.
Well, it is about endless possibilities, but if you think about, you know, the first time anyone saw an airplane go up in the air, they must have thought, "Oh my God, what's going on here?" You know, we've been in horses and carriages for a while, and then there's motor cars, and there's airplanes. I mean, I sometimes do look up and I think, you know, when you imagine what it must have been like to see that first airplane go up, let alone the people landing on the, you know, going out in space. These are things that you have to find a way to work on. We had an industrial revolution, then we had the digital revolution, and we need to work out how to live with this and how to improve our lives through it. And it's not easy. And this area, this is a very big challenge indeed. And there's also this issue of profit and control. Who's doing it? Who's benefiting from it? And as I say, none of it is easy. I mean, we've seen the COP conferences going on right now, and we've seen that there are vested interests in oil and certain kinds of which and fossil fuels, which make it a challenge to certain parts of the world. And we know that those who are most vulnerable to this crisis and of the environment are peoples in parts of the world where they're already struggling, and we need to help and share and ensure that we remember others too, and not just, these countries in the West who are doing all right. Thank you very much. No, these are troubling times.
Are you excited about what AI can do for you, Alan Yentob?
Not particularly for me. No, I'm not. I think I'm in my last chapter, but I think it's what it can do for the future, for the next generation, for looking after those who are in poverty and homeless and out of work and struggling and ignored. That's the most important thing, and making a fairer world. And I just hope that people understand that it takes, you've got to make sacrifices. Some of us who have need to help those who haven't, and that means also those in the richer parts of the world need to help the others too. And we need it, as I say, to come together and talk about how we can achieve this.
It's interesting that you say that you're in the final chapter. You're not in the final chapter, Mr. Yentob. You're still churning out programs. I can see the ideas in your mind. You're still excited by life. I can, we're supposed to be talking about the arts. We've not talked about the arts. We're talking about life, because that is.
Sure, but that's one
Is
thing that hasn't changed, despite, I'm sure it will change. It hasn't changed the fact that it's only when you get to a certain age that you realize that, there is, one way or another, the thing that AI hasn't yet changed is how long we live and what our lifespan is. And that lifespan increases for some. It doesn't for others. In other parts of the world, people die much earlier. So wealthy countries have a longer lifespan. Now, obviously, it's funny that, of course, the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezos of this world are now thinking about how we can just extend our lives and beyond and beyond. And who knows in 100 years' time how long people will be living. But nevertheless, there is, human life is limited. And then there are these great figures like David Attenborough, who is a legend and an icon. And there he is, he's 97. If anyone hasn't seen Planet Earth 3, they need to watch it. It's an absolute revelation. It's amazing. These natural history programs that David does are just, and not just David, but David and his team and the teams he's created. And I'm very thankful and grateful that I've been able to help in this area, because I've been involved with the Natural History Unit and brought in someone called Alistair Fothergill, who was a 20-something-year-old when I made him head of the Natural History Unit, and he's amazing, and so are his successors. And how did I appoint Alistair Fothergill? Because I asked David Attenborough who we should appoint, and he said, well, there's this young guy called Alistair Fothergill. He's a man to put in there, and we did. So really, there are, that's a show I think now that everyone should watch, of all generations. It's magical what you see, what you didn't know about, and what you can discover. It's just incredible.
It is absolutely wonderful. You've mentioned money a few times now. So whilst we're at it, we might as well deal with the controversy of which you've been cleared. You're naughty, aren't you, Mr. Alan Yentob? I read somewhere in one of your interviews that you're the naughty twin. And apparently in the Yentob family, all the Allens are naughty. When I say naughty, I mean mischievous. You know I mean mischievous, don't you? I don't mean naughty.
Yes. Well, there are a lot of Allens, and we're a very bonded family. I'm a Jewish Iraqi Jew from my family came from Iraq. They were Jews from Iraq. They were thrown out of Iraq, like many others. But they're all over the world, and every Wednesday since COVID began, about at least 100 of us get together on Zoom. It'll be this afternoon at 7 o'clock. We'll all get wherever we are in the world, and we'll have a conversation. And we have themes. We have music themes. We have art themes. We have memories themes about our childhood, and we share it with people we haven't seen, children of children of children who are there, who were living in another part of the world, in India or in Canada or in Edinburgh or wherever it is. And we get together. We get together twice a year, all the different generations. At least 100 of us gather together in different places, And that's the way the world is today. And I just think that we, that's another thing, this conversation between different generations, learning from the past. You started off saying, well, we older people know things which they can share. That's why I say, let the young generation plunge into the past and realize that there is relevance and a source of insight for them in the past, as well as and lessons for the future, which need to be learned.
Yes, I want to join your group. So that's number one. It sounds wonderful. So I'll be there at 7 o'clock tonight, she says. I'm joking. You said a few things then. And I know that there is this great push towards informing and helping and guiding the next generation, Alan. But, there's a lot of us that are around that we've got an awful lot of living to do ourselves. So it's not just about the young. And, if you're talking about the arts, and you and I, we dig it. So we can have this conversation. We of course. But for an awful lot of people, it's like whoosh over the head. They don't see any relevance. They don't see any resonance, which again, I think is why what's happening in Manchester and at Eviva is so important. And we started this by you talking about the film that you'd made, and you talked about Danny Boyle, and you also talked about managing to get it commissioned on New Year's Eve. That for me, Alan Yentob, is where I will jump in and say, yeah, but you can't you? Because you have access. Because the big thing that is missing, actually, or I find an area that is really, really difficult, is finding the way in. Obviously.
Well, the way it is difficult. I have access because I've earned that access, really, in terms of access, because I've been there all that time. I've been loyal to it. I continue to do it. I have a very close relationship with, all those people who are, running the BBC or have run it, because I've been with them and I've mentored a lot of them myself. So I think you have to earn that right, and you have to do what you can. But to say that there aren't difficulties, of course there are. And I think in the industry that we're in, the media industry, it's tough at the moment. Even it's tough for the big players, the Apples and the Netflixes and the Warner Brothers and the Fox, all these people. The question is, there's huge competition out there, and it's putting prices up. It means that there are those things that we need to protect, like what we call arts and culture. That may not be as popular, as you say, as entertainment, and therefore it gets diminished. So it's very important that art and culture do continue to resonate, and for Britain particularly, because the creative industries in the UK are extremely important, and not just their cultural benefit, but their economic benefits, which are underplayed. The fact that there are theatres open in Britain, that there are the television, and that much of the work that is now seen around the world is made in Britain now, and that is incredibly important. So people come to Britain to go to the theatre. They go to hotels. They spend money. This is exactly what the leader of the council in Manchester was saying about this very significant investment in the Aviva Studios, or as I like to call it, Factory International, because that will see a return on investment. This seems to have been endorsed by everybody, including the head of the Arts Council and Lucy Fraser as well, that it will bring in 100 million a year of revenues. And the other important thing, which I think we heard, is that it isn't just for Manchester. It is for beyond Manchester. It's for, and the wonderful thing, and this is very much Danny's gift as well. I worked with Danny and helped him as much as I could on the opening ceremony of the Olympics in 2012, which was fantastic, I think. And he brought the same values to it. He wanted to be inclusive. He wanted to bring the young in. He wanted to join up generations and different art forms. And he's done that there. I mean, it was Free Your Mind's a dance work, but it's not just a dance work, it's storytelling. And those great guys running it, you know, they're fabulous, you know.
It's a triumph.
Mikey and Henry, yeah.
It's a triumph. And again, you know, I'm somebody who goes to the arts, who digs the arts. I was impressed. And I don't mean like you've got to do something to impress Audrey Hall. I don't mean that at all. I mean that when you're in it and you're sort of talking about it all the time, you know the lines, I don't know, inclusivity, oh, diversity, oh, this, oh, that. You know those lines, you know that you're hearing them all the time. But to actually go there, I witnessed that in living practice by the people who were there, by the conversations that people were having, by the excitement that the thing generated, by the work itself, by the whole thing itself. It was a real.
Yeah, one of the most exciting things about that event was the way that Danny brought it. I mean, the two sides to this. One was the argument about diversity and older people and bringing people in and giving them space in the Aviva studios to tell their stories and to share those stories, you know, an older generation as well, excited by it. And then the younger generation, the digital realm and the digital work in Free Your Mind was all achieved by these excited young people who Danny brought in and every week would talk to them. And that sense also of a city is very important. We're now watching cities being destroyed and homes being demolished in Ukraine and in Gaza. And it's shocking. It tells you how important community is, how important your home is. And Danny, of course, comes from Manchester. And what was so sweet was that many people who didn't come from Manchester but went to Manchester to work there feel they are Mancunians too. And they want to be able to share that experience and that love of this city with others too. And the way that Aviva International, I call it international because that's what the Manchester International Festival did. It managed to create collaborations. It managed to bring different art forms together. It managed to be international, which again is a way of sharing experiences, but also very importantly of being able to support financially this ambitious program that exists and is supported by hopefully central and local government and by the local people.
Okay, local people, Manchester, you've got a connection to Manchester too. I know that you feel that you hold it very dearly too. But what are you going to say, Alan, to Mrs. whoever from Manchester who's working 2 and 3 jobs at the moment just to feed her kids and keep the family in the home? How are we going to get Mrs. Smith to understand that there's a benefit to her and it's of benefit for her too?
Well, this is a very complex and very challenging situation, not just in the UK, but worldwide, that there is a huge gap between those who have and those who don't have, and it's getting wider and wider. And really, in a sense, we can talk about culture, but also what about food? What about living? What about work?
What about class?
And what about having a home to live in? I mean, these are very important things and they need to be resolved. And you know, governments need to pay attention to those who are only just barely able to survive. So really, the important thing to say is that culture is part of this story. The culture is about telling stories about our lives and who we are. And therefore, you know, in a way, Free Your Mind tries to do that as well. You know, it talks about Black Lives Matter. It relates to all these things. And also, you know, some might say, given the prosperity in Manchester and all those skyscrapers going up, but actually Manchester doesn't need leveling up. But Manchester needs to draw in not just Greater Manchester, but the north of England into this promising space that it's got, and to share that experience. And that will make a difference. And that will, we're now living in a world where there are opportunities, actually. This is not just AI, but the digital realm, whereby everyone, once upon a time, you couldn't, the industry, the TV industry, whatever, was in the hands of a few. But now everyone is empowered. This machine you're looking at here, and you've got there,
Yes.
you can make films out of this. You can make feature films out of it. You can tell stories. You can share them on YouTube. So everyone has an opportunity. And by using it effectively, by using this machine effectively, you can free your mind yourself, but not just by going to the same spot and playing games. There's so much else to discover through this. And we've never had that opportunity before. I mean, the old days, to find out things, I couldn't live without this machine, to learn things. You've got to be a bit skeptical, but it's a very valuable resource. I mean, I recently have been when I'm making films now, I use my phone a lot of the time to film things. I did a film about Mel Brooks called Mel Brooks Unwrapped, in which 15 minutes of the film was shot on my iPhone, and that went out on HBO in America, and they said to me, can you get a higher quality out of it? I said, certainly not. That's it. You're lucky to have it. And they agreed, and it went out.
Yeah.
So the world is changing, and this technology empowers people to tell stories, just like you're doing your podcast. You wouldn't have been able to do that 20 years ago. You're now able to take control and to think people aren't powerless. They are able. But at the same time, you need food, you need education, and education is also available via this source.
Yes. Yes. You touched on race, and obviously you and I have both been talking about class. And 2020, Alan, I mean, something else that I've not said is that an awful lot of the work that you do is giving a voice to the giving a voice to the voiceless. It sometimes allows in the voice of the voiceless. Should we say that? Because I know that you go for the big names, but you are also doing that. And 2020 was a really, really big year for Black people. When I say big year, I mean it was an awful year for Black people. It was kind of off the back of Brexit and Trump, and then we had COVID, and then we had George Floyd, and then we had Grenfell, and then we had the Windrush, and it went on and
Absolutely,
on.
Yeah.
And 2020, Alan, honestly, for me was, I say to everybody, it was for me is where it really, really made a difference. It wasn't so much that George Floyd changed my life, but the effects of what happened, the implications of what happened after George Floyd changed my life. Not only in terms of the blah going on out there, but in terms of who I am, what my own life was, what I'd lived with all of these years, as somebody born in Britain, but not living, actually, Alan, in the Black community, not living the traditional, that kind of a life, unsurprisingly married somebody white the first time and the second time, incidentally, because I was brought up English. I wasn't brought up.
Absolutely. Well, I think people need to understand this, and it's very difficult for someone like you, born here, who sees yourself as a Brit, integrated in that community, offering a different perspective on the world. I mean, that's what's so rich and so great about certain cities, that you do have this. Now, some people resent it and resist it. And one of the reasons they resent it and resist it is partly because they're struggling as well. I mean, this whole immigration thing is a problem, but there's an irony in all this, that if you think about the Priti Patels of this world and these politicians, Suella Braverman and all that, it's so ironic. Even Donald Trump, he's an immigrant, and his family were immigrants, and yet his attitude to immigrants is, let's get rid of them. So it's ironic we've arrived at this stage, where these people can forget about their own lives and that the fact that they had access here and they were allowed to come to Britain, try to make things better, try to understand. But ironically, no, it's not necessarily happening. But I think the other thing about Black Lives Matter is it's so extraordinary that that one incident of George Floyd created this sort of revelation that in all these years things looked like they were getting better, but they weren't really getting that much better. And that was shocking, I think.
There you go. There you go. And that was it, Alan. But you know what happened? What was wonderful is that the world said enough is enough. It was the world. So that was wonderful. That was number one. Complicit silence was also supposed to be ended. So that was also wonderful. But that actually, Alan, is when the thirst and hunger for celebrity really started to almost take hold. And the only people that they wanted to hear from was somebody who had a celebrity name. It was weird. It was a kind of a topsy-turvy world where you felt important, but you also felt irrelevant at the very, very same time. And, you know, I found that in that period, hundreds of people, whether they were involved in the arts or not, took to the arts, took to writing poetry or some prose or some sort of creative art form to kind of explain what they were going through their way. It did bring about the most amazing creativity. Did you witness that as well?
Well, I do, and there's stories that go back on this. I mean, one of the people in the film I made about Manchester, the factory, is that, well, I love him, is Lem Sisse. And Lem wrote his book and his story, and I made a film about it. And Lem's story is extraordinary. And it was poetry and art and culture that saved Lem.
Yes.
You know, a boy abandoned, you know, by the system, you know, abandoned by his mother, but not necessarily. It's not about, he doesn't lay blame necessarily, but the world is complex. And Lem has triumphed in the most amazing way. I mean, he loves Manchester, Lem. He loves language and poetry. He didn't sit there feeling sorry for himself. He moved himself forward and on. I think Lem is fantastic.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Lem because I've not been in the industry quite as long as you, Mr. Yentob, but you know, it's knocking on 30 years. And Lem I know from days of old. So Lem I know from the day he started, and he was labeled as angry black youth. Do you remember?
Yes, I do. Well, when he used to do his, yeah.
That's what they used to call Lem all the time. You know, angry black man. I mean, and common world and culture
anyway,
world.
it's nonsense. He's not an angry black man.
Nonsense. Well, it is absolute nonsense. This is the whole point. And but this is what happens, Alan, and this is when you start talking about, you know, I said to you that like the huge impact that George Floyd had on me. It's kind of understanding what's going on, because no, this is the language and this is the sort of stuff that we hear all the time. You know, if black people articulate anything, if we say anything, if I say it, a woman says anything, oh, aggressive, you know, chip on the shoulder, oh, got a real problem. And no, I'm just articulating the reality of life.
Well, there are some changes. I mean, I think, for instance, women's football. Look at the sports.
Yes.
You know,
yeah.
So the winning of that by England's goalkeeper, that's changing. The Me Too moment of change. I mean, Harvey Weinstein will be remembered not so much for those films he managed to take credit for, but for being the person who created the Me Too movement. So there are changes. Things are getting better. People are learning more. But, you know, these things still go on. But there have been some advantages. And, you know, the Black Lives Matter is one, the Me Too movement is another. And those things have really risen in terms of people's consciousness. They're difficult to avoid. That injustice does go on. So the police force, you know, the education system, the care system, these things, there are revelations and things that need to be understood there. And, you know, I've been through a lot of these things myself. I was chairman of Kids Company, which I absolutely loved and which was absolutely vilified. And then there was a court case. A woman was the judge. She totally vindicated us. 5 years of thing. What's happened to those children now? What's going on in those care homes? And then the hacking thing. I was hacked by the Mirror. I went to court. I won the case. I was hacked for 7 years, at least 3 times a week, according to the judge. I've just been on the World at One, and my lawyer was David Sherborne, the man who's now doing all these cases, and my dear cousin Gerald Chamash, who is a lawyer who is also involved in all this case and lived in Manchester. We all come from Manchester. You know, that's where my family were. Before culture, there was cotton, and that's what my family were in. And the cotton industry collapsed, and they came to London. But this, you know, there are so many stories and lessons to be learned, and there are positive things. So those Black Lives Matter, Me Too, those things, everyone knows what they are. They need to learn from those experiences. And women's rights are beginning to be understood better than they were. And hopefully we will make progress. But people are able, one of the most shocking things that's happened in the last 10 years is not just Donald Trump's rise in the country that we thought represented democratic rights, despite the fact it's been through all that it's been through, you know, in terms of human rights and Black lives and the rest of it. But America still was, in some ways, for many of us, a place where it's a country made of immigrants. You know, colonialism left, it developed into something extraordinary. But it's not just Donald Trump. It's the fact that a huge percentage of the American population seem to be, and those people who are often the victims of this system, seem to think Donald Trump can do no wrong. I mean, that's more shocking than Donald Trump. There are plenty of Donald Trumps around, but not most of them have got the support of 40% of the American population. That's absolutely.
Well, you talk about it being shocking. And I'm just going to draw the parallel with Brexit, because what it's about basically is about people being made to feel less than.
Yes.
That's what it's been for me. That's my easiest way.
You said it. That's exactly right. That's the same.
And it's
all of this is about
fight that we've been having since the days of slavery. So if you listen to my shows on, you'll hear me say I'm bored. I'm bored of talking about the same things. I'm bored of trotting out and going, holding the hands out and going, you know, here we go, it's Black Lives Matter or it's Black History Month. No, my show is Black History Month every show, because we're talking about living history. We're talking about the reality of life. We're talking about the reality of our existence. And it is actually different in a lot of subtle ways, but it's also glorious, absolutely glorious. So it's not like it's all doom and gloom and stuff to moan about. We've got stuff to celebrate too. And it's I think having a way to bring all of that out is kind of what Mr. Alan Yentob does. That's kind of your job, isn't it?
I mean, many do, but it's interesting what you say, because one of the things about what you're doing, the podcasts and the podcast industry, which is growing, is podcasts are an opportunity to have a conversation, to talk about these issues, not simply, you know, to represent a point of view, but to actually have a dialogue. And the more podcasts are getting more and more popular, and I think that's good. It means you can go and listen to things and hear both sides of the argument, and then make your mind up and try to find the way forward. So yes, I think that's also a good thing. That's the word P for podcast is another thing you can put up there eventually, and hope that is a learning experience as well.
Yes, but we still need the BBCs. You mentioned Kids Company, and I want to just very quickly ask you one question. You know, I know you said it broke your heart. With hindsight, would you have done anything differently?
Not very much, no. And actually, one of the things I have to say about David Cameron is that he supported Kids Company till the very end, you know, and continued to do so. And it was this is my generosity. It was Newsnight who ran a story which made Newsnight the kids company close. That's what the judge said at the time, that it shouldn't have happened, that the allegations of misconduct were untrue. What we had done was we went over budget, where there was a kind of problem there, and Camilla is someone who had to be managed in that way. However, the work she did was exceptional. The team that she had were great, and I do not have any. I regret. Did we do everything right? No, but mind you, the judge said we did. Frankly, but no one does everything right. But was it the right thing? Was it a model that could have been followed by others? Was it a way of not just putting people into categories or denying things? Every time we challenged a local authority about, whether or not they had a responsibility to the kids, we never lost the case. But the fact is that the local authorities were in trouble because the government was taking money away from them. Yes. And they still are. You can see the latest thing about local councils. They don't have the money they once had. It's like the BBC. BBC should do this, but 30% of its budget's been taken away by central government. We have to understand these things. That, there are sacrifices which have to be made, definitely, in these times. Yes, whether it's, because of inflation, because of cost of living, the rest of it, it's not easy. But we need decent human beings to run these things and to try to explain why things are happening and to look after those who are most dispossessed and unfortunate. And there are too many of those across the world, whether you go to Washington or San Francisco or London or Manchester or anywhere, there are people on the streets suffering, and they need to be looked after. And these are problems that shouldn't be happening in this day and age.
I've kept you for so long, and I want to talk about Russell's film, because it really touched me, Alan. I was actually moved to tears in parts.
Well, I have to say, when you look at It's a Sin and when he talks about Andrew.
Honestly, it was like, my age, so it's not like I'm a baby. It's not like I don't know what the world's about. It's not like I don't understand gay rights. I talked about the first thing that I did in broadcasting actually was an AIDS and HIV helpline. It was one of the first things I did in broadcasting, 1989, at the BBC. You were my boss. Who knew? No, I don't know if you were boss. Were you my boss in 1989? Were you?
No, I was boss.
Overall boss. When I say boss,
I was BBC Two in 1989.
Yeah. I mean, right at the top there. But it was one of the first things that I did. So, it's not that I am not aware, but honestly, it was like an education, Alan. I was moved to tears. It was like bits of the jigsaw slotted into place. You actually needed to hear all of the interviews from the actors, from the creatives, from the directors, from that most marvelous lady whose name escapes me. Forgive me. She's the most important lady where her hair's white at the front. And she,
Sarah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Happy Valley. Yeah.
Unbelievable. When you needed, it's almost like you needed all of that stuff, Alan, to actually make sense of quite a lot of stuff that was going on.
Well, when Russell said
through drama, through life.
Yeah, when Russell talked about A Very British Scandal and Jeremy Thorpe, and that brilliant series that he wrote and that my dear friend Stephen Frears directed, that was an amazing series. And what he said that was most touching was how that period was a period when you couldn't say you were one of them. He was only liberated to talk about HIV after Andrew had died, and the experience that his great friend Jill told him about. But I have my own experience in the beginning of this. At the beginning of the Arena program, when I started it all those years ago, the Arena that we know, I had two colleagues, young colleagues, who worked with me. One is called Anthony Wall, and he's still here, and he's been a great contributor to. You should talk to him one day about Arena, because the Arena archive is going to go into Manchester University, and
Yes,
it's going to be there. But the other thing is that Nigel Finch was the other person who we worked with, who made some absolutely wonderful programs, including about AIDS. And Nigel died of AIDS, and I sat next to him as he was dying, and I'll never, ever forget it. And that was many years ago. So we witnessed it. We saw it happening. And when one of your closest friends dies at that time when no one spoke of it, that was a deeply shocking experience, and we'll never forget it, ever, ever forget it. And that reminded me, as I sat by Nigel's bed and he was dying, and he was still thinking creatively, and then watching It's a Sin, and that incredibly touching scene of the mother with the boy sitting and sort of not really understanding what was going on until that moment. No, it was incredibly moving. And Russell is an exceptional character, and he sent a note to everyone after the film. When we watched it, he thought he was going to hate it, and he couldn't believe how much he loved it.
Honestly, Alan, it moved me to tears. It made me draw breath, and it was like putting a jigsaw together. You know, when things kind of slot into place, it's like, but when things kind of slot into place, it's kind of put into context like that. You're like, okay, I get it now. I get it now. And there's so many parallels that can be drawn against, homosexuality, homophobia, racism, sexism. There's some people who are different. I think there was a line in one of your, I can't remember if it was in the first film or the second film, where you talk about people, it's about people who are different or being different or something. And there's so many parallels that we can draw in our lives. That whole idea of, kids being sent home to die locked up in their parents' bedroom, the parents of shame. You sort of think about, young girls getting pregnant and what used to happen then. They were hidden away in the hills somewhere. There's so many things like that you can sort of go, okay, so that happened in the church, that happened with racism, that happened with, and there's so many, because we're all people who somehow are, as I say, made to feel somehow less
well,
than.
you're taking us back to these other things. We talked about Black Lives Matter, but there's another issue where you can go backwards. Donald Trump managed to change an extraordinary judgment in the American courts called Roe versus Wade, which was about about abortion, allowing it to happen. So that America was liberating abortion, and he managed to change that law. I mean, to go backwards in time. So, you've got to be alert to the fact that don't get blasé, don't get complacent. Whether it's about Black Lives Matter or about, well, we're now LGBT. That's kind of a really difficult area to deal with as well. We've got to find our way through this to protect young people, but also to liberate people, to allow them to be themselves. Marriage between two people of the same sex, all this, church having to address this, is it going to be allowed or not allowed? These are the challenging questions, and they include a responsibility to young children, but also an obligation to find yourself and have your own life. So nothing is going to be easy going forward, but there are glimmers of light and there are dark shadows. So we need to find our way through these. And the way to find our way is to keep informing yourself, keep asking questions, keep being curious. So that's it. That's my message after my relatively long and lucky life.
And we have to find a way to find humour. And that's also something that you've managed to do, Mr. Yentob, haven't you?
Well, that is true. And I think Russell is a very great example of that, how that moment when he says about when Andrew was dying and he was sort of almost gone, and he wanted to get married. And the last thing on earth I wanted to do was to get married. I mean, that was such a brave and bold and loving thing to say. And yet it was a sort of denial of something that a lot of people had said, my God, how shocking. His lover of 20 years wants to get married, and he can't face it. But that's not what you felt. You felt something else.
It was gorgeous, Alan. Honestly, it was just gorgeous. So yeah, one that you should feel hopefully rightfully proud of. And please do tell him that I'm gonna go and look and see everything that he's ever done.
And follow him on Instagram. He's on Instagram.
So many resonances with stuff that he was saying. I was just like, oh my God, let me talk to this person. He's wonderful. Yeah. I felt, I felt good. You feel better at the end of it as well. It's kind of like you're left with a kind of a hope. Your program's called Imagine, and I just mentioned humor then, and obviously the one that we've got to look forward to is the return of Jennifer and the Ab duo. Dawn.
Yeah, Dawn and Jennifer. Yeah.
What could we expect from this one?
Well, bitchy bitter. That's I think it's great fun. They're an absolutely lovely couple. They're still friends after all these years, and it's a story about Britain, which is really interesting. You talk about humor. The comic strip and the early years of the comic strip, Ade Edmondson and Rick Mayall, and the whole galaxy of performers who came out of that era, including French and Saunders, and the only two girls allowed in the group, one way or another. So I think that was a critical moment of a new generation of humor which arrived in Britain. And talking about other things, a lot of those successful humorists at the time, I won't mention names, but were quite right-wing and quite sexist and racist even. And they ushered in a new era. And some of them are still with us, including French and Saunders. So no, I think people will love it. It's down there as in the Sunday Times and the Radio Times as one of the best films for Christmas. So look forward to it.
Oh wow, okay. Can I ask you, is there anything, Alan, that's not funny? Is there anything that we shouldn't make light of?
This is very difficult. I mean, for instance, I think that the thing we have to be careful about is not eliminating the past and learning lessons. So all this stuff of let's cut stuff out from Little Britain, for instance. I love Little Britain. Did you or didn't you?
Do you know, I'm going to say I used to watch Rising Damp. I loved Rising Damp. Seriously, this is what I'm telling you about being brought up. Born black, obviously born black. Well done, Audrey. English, born, my mum and dad came here in 1955. So I was born the end of 1959. But we were brought up as English. We weren't brought up as black. We didn't live in a black community. We didn't have those things, I mean, we had reference into it, and my reference into it started with music, and then you start going to it and start going out and understanding. And it was when I started broadcasting, Alan, that I really got an understanding of the difference of my life living with my white husband and child in Sale as my counterpart's life living in Moss Side, struggling, having to work 2 and 3 jobs and trying to look and see the difference of circumstance. It really did make a difference. So it was like, no, we're not all the same, Alan. But we're not all the same.
But also irony, satire, all these things, I think we need to, try to understand the past and understand some of these things and not just eliminate them. It's like, we need to discuss them. But I love Little Britain, and I don't think it was intended to be, whatever. It was intended to be playful and to share those experiences. And the way these things are sort of eliminated, or even, John Cleese and, going on about whatever. I mean, you can't. John Cleese is John Cleese, but he was an incredibly gifted performer and entertainer.
But don't you think it's somebody with today's views trying to impart that value onto something that actually at the time was just entertainment and fun and nice, I wouldn't be
Well,
changing.
some of it wasn't.
I wouldn't be
Some of
deleting
this
the
early
work.
stuff, I'm talking of very early stuff, there was some really bad stuff on, which, or not really bad, but bad enough. But no, I think where you can't understand irony and humor and things like that,
Yeah.
I think, yes, you're absolutely right. We can't just sort of eliminate things like that. We need to understand why they happened and what they were. And some is good and some isn't so good. And I keep saying, nobody is perfect. There is, even the goodies have bad moments. It's not as simple as that. But we need to not put everybody in a category and say that's not there. So there you are. I've got to go now. So
I know, it's no problem. You have been absolutely amazing. And what's, I think, totally inspiring to me is you're still excited. I can see it. You start talking about the stories and you're still excited and you're still passionate. And you've been doing it even longer than me. And that's because you believe in the story, you believe in the people, the same thing, the thing that gets your heart beating.
that's right.
I think that we are very lucky to have you. And they should have made you the Director General of the BBC, shouldn't they?
I'm happy as I am. That's all fine. Lovely to talk to you, Audrey,
You
and
too.
stay in touch.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 So there you go. Mr. Alan Yentob, Mr. BBC himself, a wonderful enabler of the arts for over half a century and still going strong. And incidentally, in case you're wondering, and before you ask, there's no funny business going on in my introduction of Alan as the man who said yes to me and meant it, or at least yet. I'm always open to new possibilities. So watch this space, Mr. Yentob, and imagine me thanks, or perhaps a later with Jules with Audrey Hall. Wouldn't that be something, folks? But seriously, I introduced Alan as such because he agreed to the interview and did it. And even better for me, as you'll hear within our chat, endorse the purpose and value of my podcast and what I do in my radio show, which of course is sharing a different perspective of informed opinion, which is just so cool. So thank you, Alan Yentob, a man of integrity who helped to define entertainment over a generation through that same integrity, truth, honesty, and beauty. Of course, evidenced and brought to life by the visionary creatives involved in Alan's life of film. And long may it continue. So that's almost it for this time on the Undisputed Music Legends. Alan provided an amazing insight into the BBC, the arts, and the impact of the digital transformation of the creative industries. And to paraphrase, Alan says, these are the conversations that are needed to help us to open our minds, look, listen, and learn and share, all with the purpose of working towards a fairer world. And you can't say better than that, because my Undisputed Music Legends are the guys helping to drive that narrative. So, thank you for listening. Do please remember to like and subscribe for more. And until the time when I meet another Undisputed Music Legend, this is Audrey Hall saying enjoy the groove and positive vibes. Until the next time.